History remembers results, it rarely remembers timing, but timing may be the most powerful force shaping what humanity accepts as truth, because an idea is not judged only by whether it's correct, it's judged by when it appears. Across centuries, the same pattern repeats. A person proposes something new, people hear it, they reject it, not always because it's wrong, often because it arrives before the world has the tools, language or mindset to understand it. When that happens, the idea doesn't fail logically, it fails socially. We tend to imagine recognition as something that naturally follows discovery, as if truth automatically rises to the surface. But history suggests something far less comforting. Truth doesn't rise, it waits. Sometimes for years, sometimes for generations, sometimes for centuries. There have been thinkers whose work was ignored not because it lacked evidence, but because it lacked context. Their ideas required a future that didn't exist yet. Without that future, their words sounded strange, unrealistic, even absurd. And once society labels something absurd, it often stops examining it. This creates a strange illusion. From the present, we look back and see certain figures as obvious geniuses. Their insights seem clear, logical, almost inevitable. But to the people living at the same time as them, those insights often looked confusing or unnecessary. Genius is rarely obvious in real time. It usually becomes obvious only after history edits the story. Timing doesn't just affect ideas, it affects art. There are works that hung unnoticed for decades, paintings stored in attics, sketches misfiled in archives, objects dismissed as copies. Their physical form never changed. The colors didn't improve. The brushstrokes didn't sharpen. The only thing that changed was recognition. Someone looked again and saw what had always been there. That moment when something ordinary becomes extraordinary without physically changing reveals how much value depends on perception. The masterpiece didn't become valuable. It was recognized as valuable, which means value is not always a property of the object. Sometimes it's a property of awareness. Recognition, like discovery, has timing. Too early, and it doesn't happen. Too late, and it rewrites history. Entire reputations have been built decades after the person responsible was gone. There are individuals celebrated today who died believing they had failed, not because they lacked ability, because their era couldn't interpret them. We often assume intelligence guarantees influence, but intelligence without timing can look indistinguishable from error. When someone understands something long before others, they cannot prove it in a way others accept. Their reasoning depends on assumptions no one else shares yet, so their conclusions sound disconnected from reality even if they're accurate. This is one of the quietest paradoxes in human history. Being correct too early can produce the same reaction as being wrong. Society tends to reward ideas when they feel familiar enough to be comfortable. But familiarity doesn't always mean correctness. It often just means the mind already has a place to store what it's hearing. When a concept has no existing mental category, the brain struggles to process it, and what the brain struggles to process it often rejects. That's why some discoveries seem to appear twice in history. The first time, they're ignored. The second time, they're praised, not because the second discoverer was smarter, because the world had changed enough to understand them. The unsettling implication is that humanity may have dismissed correct ideas many times simply because they arrived too soon. And if that happened before, it can happen again. Somewhere right now, there may be ideas that sound strange, unrealistic, or unnecessary, not because they are wrong, but because they belong to a future perspective that doesn't exist yet. The same pattern appears in cultural phenomena. Sometimes a symbol, phrase, or idea spreads rapidly without a clear origin. People repeat it before they understand it. It appears in conversations, messages, jokes. No one can point to where it started. That kind of spread is fascinating because it reveals something about human behavior. People don't only share things they understand, they share things that feel significant. Meaning can be assigned after something spreads, not before. This is how certain trends, sayings, or references seem to materialize out of nowhere. They move through groups, especially younger ones. Not because they were logically explained, but because they triggered curiosity. Mystery itself becomes fuel. When something feels like it might have hidden meaning, people repeat it just to be part of the pattern. in a way that mirrors how recognition works in history. First comes the signal. Understanding comes later. If you step back, all these patterns, ignored ideas, rediscovered art, forgotten geniuses, unexplained trends, follow the same structure. Something appears, it isn't understood. Time passes, then suddenly it is. The change doesn't happen inside the idea, it happens inside the observer. We like to think progress is the accumulation of knowledge, but it may be more accurate to describe it as the accumulation of readiness. The world doesn't accept ideas when they're proven, it accepts them when it's prepared. Preparation is invisible. You can't measure it directly, but you can see its effects. A concept rejected in one century becomes obvious in another. A painting overlooked in one decade becomes priceless in the next. A person ignored in life becomes legendary in history. None of those transformations required the subject to change. Only the context changed. That suggests something quietly profound. Understanding is not just about information. It's about timing plus perspective plus readiness. Remove any one of those, and even the clearest truth can remain unseen, which leads to a question history doesn't answer for us. It only hints at it. How many correct ideas exist right now that the world isn't ready to recognize? How many modern thinkers will be understood only decades from now? And how many things we dismiss today will look obvious to people in the future? Because if the past has shown anything consistently, it's this. Humanity is not just a species that discovers. It's a species that overlooks, and sometimes what we overlook isn't meaningless. Sometimes it's simply early.